The Beaumont Museum of Art was a cathedral of silence and light. During the day, it was a hushed sanctuary where patrons whispered in front of masterpieces. At night, it transformed into a shadowy labyrinth of priceless treasures, watched over by a state-of-the-art security system and a young man who seemed to value his phone screen far more than any Rembrandt. That young man was Caleb. To the museum's staff, he was little more than a necessary annoyance, a lazy, indifferent night guard who slumped in his chair, earbuds in, scrolling endlessly through social media. Miss Albright, the museum's ruthlessly ambitious curator, saw him as a symbol of the decline of the modern work ethic. The museum director, a man who worshipped technology and data, saw Caleb's analog presence as a quaint but inefficient redundancy. They saw the slouch, the disinterest, the faint aura of someone going nowhere, slowly. No one would have ever believed he was a ghost, a legend from a world they could never comprehend, hiding in the last place anyone would ever think to look. Welcome to Untold Tales, where we illuminate the stories of silent legends and forgotten heroes. Our channel is dedicated to the powerful idea that the most extraordinary individuals are often hidden in plain sight, their true capabilities masked by quiet humility or deliberate obscurity. The story of Caleb is a tribute to that hidden strength, a narrative of a man who had to become invisible to find the truth. Tonight was different. The Grand Gallery, home to the museum's crown jewel, the 17th century masterpiece The Alchemist's Lament, was buzzing with the low hum of champagne-fueled conversation. A select group of wealthy donors and VIPs had gathered for a private demonstration of the museum's new Aegis security system. Gavin, the system's creator, a man whose arrogance was as sharp as his designer suit, was holding court. The Aegis system is more than just lasers and sensors, Gavin announced, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. It is a fortress of light, an impenetrable digital web. Once active, nothing gets in and nothing gets out. Caleb watched from a discreet corner near the staff entrance, his security uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He wasn't listening to Gavin's speech. His eyes were fixed on The Alchemist's Lament. He had taken this job for one reason, and it hung on that wall, sealed behind layers of glass and steel. He believed a secret was hidden within its ornate, gilded frame. A secret that could clear the name of the only father he had ever known and expose a decade-old betrayal. A quiet, desperate mission that was, at this very moment, about to be thrown into absolute chaos. Tonight was different. The Grand Gallery, home to the museum's crown jewel, the 17th century masterpiece The Alchemist's Lament, was buzzing with a low hum of champagne-fueled conversation. A select group of wealthy donors and VIPs had gathered for a private demonstration of the museum's new Aegis security system. Gavin, the system's creator, a man whose arrogance was as sharp as his designer suit, was holding court. The Aegis system is more than just lasers and sensors, Gavin announced, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. It is a fortress of light, an impenetrable digital web. Once active, nothing gets in and nothing gets out. Caleb watched from a discreet corner near the staff entrance, his security uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He wasn't listening to Gavin's speech. His eyes were fixed on The Alchemist's Lament. He had taken this job for one reason, and it hung on that wall, sealed behind layers of glass and steel. He believed a secret was hidden within its ornate, gilded frame. A secret that could clear the name of the only father he had ever known and expose a decade-old betrayal. A quiet, desperate mission that was, at this very moment, about to be thrown into absolute chaos. As Gavin's presentation reached its crescendo, he gestured dramatically to a sleek chrome panel on the wall. And now, with the director's permission, we will demonstrate the full lockdown protocol. The museum director nodded eagerly, his face beaming with pride. Gavin typed a code, and the effect was instantaneous and deeply unsettling. Heavy steel doors slammed shut over every entrance and exit with a deafening boom. A lattice of brilliant red laser beams crisscrossed the room, forming a beautiful but menacing cage around the alchemist's lament. The guests applauded, a mixture of awe and nervous excitement in their eyes. "As you can see," Gavin said, his smile wide and condescending, "this gallery is now the most secure room on the planet. Even our own staff," he added, with a dismissive glance toward Caleb, "couldn't get past a single one of these lasers without triggering an armed response." Caleb didn't react. He simply shifted his weight, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered from the painting to Gavin, a flicker so brief it was almost imperceptible. He had seen that smile before, that particular brand of arrogance, in another life. The demonstration was supposed to end there. Gavin swaggered back to the control panel to deactivate the system. He typed in the code. Nothing happened. The steel doors remained shut. The lasers hummed, unwavering. He tried again, his fingers moving a little faster. Still nothing. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Just a minor glitch," Gavin said, though a bead of sweat had appeared on his temple. "The system is probably just recalibrating." But it wasn't a glitch. The lights in the gallery flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness, illuminated only by the ominous red glow of the laser grid. The backup generators, which should have kicked in instantly, remained silent. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle the edges of the polite gathering. "What's happening?" Ms. Albright demanded, her voice shrill. She shot a venomous look at Caleb, as if the lazy night guard had somehow willed this disaster into existence. "Do something," she hissed. Caleb remained in his corner, his stillness a stark contrast to the growing anxiety in the room. He wasn't looking at the panicking guests or the failing technology. He was looking at the manual override panel near the main door. It was an old, mechanical failsafe, installed decades before any digital system. Its access was protected not by a keypad, but by a complex, antique pin tumbler lock, a relic of a bygone era. A lock that Gavin, in his technological arrogance, had surely dismissed as an irrelevant antique. A lock that Caleb, and perhaps only 3 other people on the planet, knew how to open without a key. This wasn't just a crisis, it was an opportunity. The panic in the gallery began to curdle into genuine fear. The museum director was barking orders into a dead phone, his face pale in the eerie red light. Ms. Albright was alternating between berating Gavin and trying to placate a billionaire donor who looked moments away from a full-blown meltdown. Gavin himself was frantically trying to pry open the digital control panel, his earlier arrogance replaced by a frantic, wild-eyed desperation. Through it all, one man remained an island of calm. He was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He was Antoine Dubois, a celebrated security consultant and the evening's guest of honor. But the wealthy donors didn't know his real story. They didn't know that for 20 years he had been Interpol's most relentless investigator, the man who hunted the world's most sophisticated criminals. His greatest failure, the ghost that still haunted his retirement, was a case he had never solved. The hunt for a phantom art forger known only as Aperture, a prodigy who could replicate any master, down to the brushstroke, and who had vanished without a trace a decade ago. Dubois' attention was drawn away from the chaos and toward the manual override panel. He, unlike Gavin, understood the value of old-world mechanics. As he approached it, he saw the young night guard, Caleb, moving toward it with a strange, deliberate grace. "What do you think you're doing?" Gavin snarled, noticing Caleb's movement. "Get away from there. You'll only make things worse, you idiot." Caleb ignored him. He reached the panel and studied the complex circular lock. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a puzzle of brass and steel that no simple lockpick could ever hope to defeat. He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out two small, strange items: a tiny sable hair brush, the kind used for miniature painting, and a small vial containing a single drop of clear, viscous clock oil. The guests stared, bewildered. Ms. Albright scoffed audibly. Is he going to paint it open? Dubois, however, froze. His eyes narrowed, every nerve in his body suddenly on high alert. He had seen this before, not in person, but in a classified Interpol file, in a witness statement from a disgraced art dealer who had once claimed to have met Aperture. The dealer had described a bizarre ritual, a signature technique the forger used to read the soul of an object, be it a canvas or a complex mechanism. Caleb uncorked the vial and let the single drop of oil fall onto his fingertip. He dipped the brush into the oil and then, with the steady hand of a surgeon, began to paint a fine, almost invisible layer of oil onto the surface of the lock's dial. It wasn't a random application, it was a specific pattern, a delicate stroke that followed the internal architecture of the lock. He was preparing to listen to the lock, to feel its vibrations, to coax it into revealing its secrets. It was a technique of impossible subtlety and skill. And as Dubois watched the lazy, indifferent night guard execute the move with breathtaking precision, he felt the hairs on his arms stand up. It was Aperture's signature. The ghost he had hunted for a decade was standing right in front of him, dressed in a cheap security uniform. The gallery was a tableau of disbelief. Gavin stared at Caleb with contemptuous rage, Ms. Albright with exasperation, but Antoine Dubois watched with the intensity of a predator who has just found a trail long gone cold. He took a half step closer, his mind racing, connecting impossible dots. Caleb seemed oblivious to the stares. His world had shrunk to the brass dial of the lock. He placed his fingertips lightly on the oiled surface, closing his eyes for a brief second. He wasn't just touching the lock, he was communing with it. His mentor, a master craftsman who had taught him everything, used to call it listening to the steel. It was a form of mechanical empathy, feeling the faint tremor of each pin as the dial was turned, sensing the precise moment of alignment. He began to turn the dial, his movements slow and deliberate. To the others, it looked like a hopeless, random effort. To Dubois, it was a masterclass. Each subtle shift, each fractional pause was a calculated move. Caleb wasn't guessing, he was mapping the lock's internal landscape by feel alone. "This is a waste of time," the museum director boomed, his voice echoing with frustration. "Someone get a crowbar, get an axe, break the damn thing down." "No," Dubois's voice cut through the noise, sharp and absolute. Every head turned toward him. Let him work. The authority in his voice was undeniable. The director, momentarily stunned into silence by this legendary consultant contradicting him, simply nodded. Caleb's fingers continued their delicate dance. He heard the first faint click as a pin set. Then a second. He was inside, moving through the lock's defenses. His mentor had been imprisoned because of a betrayal, a setup that had led him to a high-security vault he was supposed to authenticate, not rob. The man who had betrayed him had understood technology, but he hadn't understood this. He hadn't understood the old magic, the art that lived in the fingertips, not in the code. Click, the third pin set. He was close. His mind was a whirlwind of memories. The smell of turpentine in his mentor's workshop, the weight of a brush in his hand, the bitter taste of grief and guilt that had driven him into hiding. He had become aperture to honor the beauty of creation, to prove he could stand among the masters. He had become a ghost to avenge the man who had shown him that beauty. Suddenly, a final, resonant thunk echoed in the quiet gallery. Caleb didn't smile. He simply opened his eyes, took a step back, and pulled the heavy door of the manual override panel open. Inside was a simple, large red lever. Before anyone could react, Caleb pulled it down. With a groan of protesting metal, the massive steel doors began to retract. The backup lights flickered on, flooding the room with a sterile white light. The laser grid vanished. The lockdown was over. The room was silent for a moment, and then the guests erupted in relieved applause. But they weren't applauding Caleb. They were applauding the return of the lights, the opening of the doors. He was still just the guard, the handyman who had gotten lucky. But Dubois wasn't looking at the doors. He was looking at Caleb with an expression of dawning, terrifying certainty. "That technique," Dubois said, his voice barely a whisper but cutting through the noise. "There is only one person who was ever taught to open a lock that way. The student of the master forger, Pascal." At the name Pascal, Caleb's body went rigid. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 10 years. It was the name of his mentor, the man who had died in prison, branded a thief. He looked at Dubois, and for the first time, the mask of lazy indifference fell away, revealing a flicker of something cold and sharp. The ghost was looking back at the hunter. Miss Albright, sensing the shift in power, immediately tried to seize control. "Well, thank you," she said to Caleb, her tone a patronizing pat on the head. "It seems our guard is more useful than we thought. Now, if everyone could please proceed to the main exit in an orderly fashion." "No one is going anywhere," Dubois said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He walked to the center of the room, his eyes never leaving Caleb. This was not a system malfunction. This was a deliberate act of sabotage. A wave of shocked murmurs filled the gallery. Gavin scoffed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "That's a ridiculous accusation! I designed this system. It's flawless!" "Is it?" Dubois countered, turning his piercing gaze on the engineer. "A flawless system doesn't fail. But a system with a hidden back door, a kill switch designed to create the perfect diversion, that's a different story. A diversion, perhaps, to allow someone to get close to the most valuable painting in the room during the chaos." He was talking to Gavin, but his words were for Caleb. He was laying out the pieces of the puzzle, watching to see how the young man would react. Caleb's mind was racing. He finally understood. The lockdown wasn't just a diversion, it was the trap itself. It was designed to create panic, to discredit the museum's security, and to position one man as the hero, Gavin, the man who would fix the problem he himself had created. And in the ensuing chaos, who would notice if the priceless painting was swapped with a perfect replica? A replica that could only be made by a master forger. The betrayal was a decade old, but the plan was happening right now. Gavin's plan had only one flaw. He never anticipated that the one person on Earth who could expose him, the one person who knew the truth about his past, would be standing in the same room, disguised as a lazy night guard. Caleb looked at Gavin, and a decade of cold, quiet rage began to surface. He remembered his mentor's last letter from prison, a cryptic message about a gilded snake hiding in plain sight. He now knew the snake's name. He took a step forward, away from the shadows of the wall and into the center of the gallery. He was no longer the slouching, indifferent guard. He stood straight, his presence suddenly filling the room. "He's right," Caleb said, his voice clear and steady, startling everyone who had only ever heard him mumble. He pointed a finger directly at Gavin. It was sabotage, and he was going to steal the painting. The accusation hung in the air, stunning and absolute. Gavin paled, his arrogance finally cracking to reveal the terrified rat beneath. "You're insane!" he shrieked. "Who are you going to believe? A world-renowned engineer or this nobody, this lazy, worthless night guard?" Gavin's accusation was a gamble, an appeal to the room's established social order, and for a moment it seemed to work. The museum director and Miss Albright exchanged a look that clearly sided with the celebrated tech genius over the hourly wage employee. The guests murmured in agreement. It was, after all, a ridiculous claim. But they weren't looking at the right person. They were looking at Caleb, the guard. Dubois was looking at Aperture, the legend. "A nobody?" Dubois echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. He walked until he stood between Caleb and Gavin, a living fulcrum in the balance of power. He turned to the museum director. "Do you know why I agreed to attend your event tonight? It wasn't to see a light show. It was to be near this painting." He gestured to The Alchemist's Lament. 10 years ago, the greatest art forger of the modern age, a man we called Aperture, vanished. His mentor, Pascal, was framed for a theft he did not commit and died in prison. The real traitor, the man who stole Pascal's work and sold it to a crime syndicate, was his other, lesser-known apprentice. Dubois paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then turned his full attention to Gavin, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. An apprentice who was brilliant with technology but had no true artistry, Dubois continued, his voice like chipping ice. An apprentice who betrayed his master for money and fame, and who built his entire career on stolen genius. Isn't that right, Gavin? Gavin was trembling, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. "This is a fantasy. You have no proof." "Oh, but I think we do," Dubois said calmly. "You see, Aperture had a signature, a ghost of a mark he left in his work. And Pascal, before he died, sent a coded letter to a friend, me, telling me that evidence of the betrayal, the proof of his innocence, was hidden with his favorite painting. Not in it, but with it. I never understood what he meant, until tonight." He looked at Caleb. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Caleb walked past the stunned crowd, moving directly to The Alchemist's Lament. He ignored the alarms that should have been blaring, knowing Gavin had disabled them. He ran his fingers along the bottom of the heavy ornate frame, a place no one would ever think to look. He felt a small, almost invisible seam. Using his thumbnail, he pried open a tiny, hidden compartment, no bigger than a matchbox. Inside was a minuscule, tightly rolled piece of canvas. He carefully unrolled it. It was a sliver of a painting, a miniature portrait of a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. But it was painted with a technique so flawless, so full of life and depth, that it seemed to glow in the gallery lights. It was Pascal's work, unmistakably. "My mentor's final lesson," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. He held up the canvas for Dubois to see. Painted into the scales of the snake was a string of numbers, almost microscopic. He always said, "True art holds a secret." This is a bank account number, the offshore account where Gavin laundered the money from the sale of my mentor's stolen work. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The room was utterly silent. Gavin, exposed and defeated, made a desperate run for the door, but was easily intercepted by the museum's other guards, now galvanized into action. The ghost had not only saved the painting, he had avenged his master. The arrest of Gavin was a quiet, clinical affair. The bravado and arrogance were gone, replaced by the limp, resigned posture of a man whose world had been irrevocably dismantled. As he was led away, his final venomous glare wasn't at Dubois or the police who had arrived, but at Caleb. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred for the ghost who had returned from the past to claim his soul. With the immediate threat gone, the gallery slowly returned to a state of managed chaos. Police were taking statements, museum staff were buzzing with panicked energy, and the wealthy donors were being escorted out, already crafting the story of their harrowing ordeal. In the center of it all, Caleb stood alone by the painting, the tiny canvas scroll still in his hand. He had completed his decade-long mission. The truth was out. But the victory felt hollow, a quiet, lonely echo in the now empty space of his life's purpose. Miss Albright approached him, her expression a complex mixture of awe, embarrassment, and opportunistic calculation. "Your skills, they're remarkable," she began, her voice smooth as silk. "The museum would be honored to offer you a position, perhaps as a consultant. Your expertise would be invaluable." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "I'm not looking for a job, Miss Albright," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving her sputtering in his wake. He was stopped at the edge of the gallery by Dubois. The old Interpol agent looked at him not as a criminal, but as an equal. The hunt was over, and what remained was a deep, unspoken respect. "Aperture is a ghost," Dubois said quietly. "As far as Interpol is concerned, he remains at large." The man who recovered Pascal's final masterpiece and exposed a traitor tonight was Caleb, a museum guard who rose to the occasion. A hero. It was a gift, an offer of a clean slate, a chance to finally live a life free from the shadows of his past. "And what will the hero do now?" Dubois asked. Caleb looked back at The Alchemist's Lament, the painting that had been the anchor of his life for so long. "Pascal taught me how to copy the masters," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But he always said the hardest thing to do is to create something of your own. I think I'd like to try." This was the quiet victory that mattered. Not the revenge, not the exposure, but the freedom to finally step out of the shadow of the great masters and become himself. It was a story Untold Tales champions. The moment a silent legend, their duty done, finally chooses their own path. It's in these quiet resolutions that the truest form of strength is found. Dubois nodded, a look of profound understanding in his eyes. He extended his hand. "If you ever need a patron," he said, "you know how to find me." Caleb shook his hand, a silent agreement passing between the hunter and the hunted. The ghost of Aperture was finally being laid to rest. The fallout from that night was seismic. Gavin's company, built on a foundation of lies, imploded. The investigation, fueled by the evidence from Pascal's hidden canvas, uncovered a network of high-end art fraud that sent shockwaves through the art world. Gavin's confession implicated powerful collectors and gallery owners, cleansing a rot that had festered for years. The name Aperture was whispered with renewed awe in the halls of Interpol, not as a criminal, but as a mythic figure of justice, a ghost who had returned to balance the scales. The Beaumont Museum, humbled and transformed, underwent a radical change. Ms. Albright was quietly let go, her ambition unable to hide her spectacular failure of judgment. The director implemented new protocols that valued human intuition as much as technology. The story of their lazy night guard became a mandatory part of the training for every new employee, a stark, powerful lesson in the danger of underestimation. As we at Untold Tales believe, the most important stories are the ones that force us to look deeper, past the surface, to the hidden truths that lie beneath. Antoine Dubois, in his retirement, found a new purpose. He used his connections and fortune to establish the Pascal Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to finding and funding brilliant, unknown artists who lacked the means to share their gifts with the world. It was his final act of respect for the master forger and his brilliant, haunted student. And Caleb? He vanished as completely as Aperture had a decade earlier. He didn't take Dubois' offer, nor did he seek any recognition for his actions. He simply faded away, his mission complete. Months later, in a small, dusty gallery in Florence, a new exhibition opened. It featured the work of an unknown artist, a painter with no name, known only by a small, elegant signature in the corner of his canvases, a simple, stylized aperture symbol. The paintings were breathtaking, not copies, but original works that held the soul of the old masters while speaking with a bold new voice. Art critics were mesmerized, calling the anonymous artist the most exciting discovery of the decade. The story of the night guard at the Beaumont became a legend, a piece of museum folklore. Visitors would sometimes ask to see the manual override panel, the place where the quiet hero had revealed himself. His tale serves as a powerful testament to the idea that true genius often shuns the spotlight, and that the greatest acts of courage are performed not for applause, but for the quiet, personal pursuit of justice. The story of Caleb is complete, but his legacy is a powerful reminder that heroes are all around us, disguised as ordinary people waiting for the one moment to reveal the masterpiece they have hidden inside. Subscribe to Untold Tales as we continue our mission to honor these silent legends, proving that the most profound stories are the ones the world almost missed.